Alright, so check this out. Be a little loud out there. This bridge is over the Birkenhead River, and this road goes to the community of Mount Currie, First Nations community. And this bridge right here is probably one of the most incredibly popular places for people to have encounters. Right here, right at the side of the bridge. One downriver. Right here. So my farrier had one run across the road right in front of his truck, and what scared him the most was the speed of it. I guess they're crossing down a parallel and going in the river down through there. Another friend of mine from the community up here, he was walking up this road at nighttime and had one walking behind him up the road. Numerous non-stop year-round sightings. These beings is around right here. Always and forever. I might get a hold of one of my friends from this community while I'm here and see if maybe they want to come make a video with me. We'll see. If time is right, I'll email them, message them, and see if they want to sit down and have a BS session. I know you guys are listening. I just can't commit quite yet. We'll see. Right here. For whatever reason, they are here. Right here. Check this out. I've driven by this 100 dozen times. I've never seen it before. Cool. Took a little short escape from the graduation festivities, all the screaming kids going bonkers at my friends. I can show you guys some sights. Now, I know a couple years ago I made a video up on that hill, right there. I'll put the photograph in here. That is where I stood, facing that way in this photo. And that was where I was originally accused of using a green screen. So now I'm on the other side of the lake. And they built a temporary road here while they did some work on a road below. Now they blocked it again. And right at the top of this, just up there in those trees, there's a mountain bike trail. A friend of mine found a 17-inch footprint at the head of that trail a couple years ago. This water drains down into Harrison, British Columbia. I think I've shared that already. Harrison's quite significant. I'll show you what I'm looking at here. So just down the lake a bit, a few more kilometers, some real close friends of mine used to live there. It's off-grid. Small community there, pretty cool places on the lake and stuff. And my friend, she told me that at nighttime they could hear them yelling and screaming and talking and carrying on up the slope right here, up in the timber, above the homes. And now this is a full thoroughfare all the way down the side of the lake. Always has been. So much goes on here, still today. Half expecting a rock to come lobbing off the bank here. The lake right now has got spring salmon spawning up through it, heading up to the Birkenhead Lake. See some First Nation guys out there angling. You can hear the odd one kerplunk behind me. It's very peaceful here. Let's have a listen to the peace. pretty quiet. There might be the odd vehicle come by. And years ago as well, the Green River empties on that corner over there, on that side. Birkenhead empties on this side, Green River on that side. And a handful of years ago, family lives just up there. In the evening, they had one of these Sasquatch, Sabe person just cruised right through the front yard, right in front of them. They called the cops, freaked out. The dogs that had never been in the house before ran in the house, shitting themselves. And then that whole week, there was yells, screams reported from up in that peak up there where I made the videos from. Voices booming off of there, being answered on this side that same week. And 15 or 17-inch footprints were along the bank of the Green River right there. Then too. The stories are endless around here. Endless. Anyways, let's get some voices heard while I'm taking my break. Who knows, maybe we'll hear something while I'm here. Not that I'm looking for it, but... Australian Sasquatch, aka Yowie, is the title of this email. Cooey, Steve. Cooey is Australian slang for hello. Yeah, you Aussies got a bunch of weird words down there, don't you? My husband and I have recently found your channel and thoroughly enjoy the stories you share and your philosophy on life as we currently know it. This story is my husband's and occurred in the 70s. He was erecting fences with a mate in rural Springbrook, which is in the Gold Coast hinterland about 70 kilometers south of Brisbane, Queensland, Australia. It is a very hilly region with dense rainforest. They were cutting a fence line in the dense rainforest when they smelt a horrible stench and heard a noise that sounded like a combination of a pig grunting and a dog growling about 20 meters away. They couldn't see anything due to the dense bush. My husband turned to his mate, who was a big man, to find him already running full speed in the opposite direction. He then took off after him. They returned to the job 2 days later after stopping at the forest ranger station on the way to ask him if there had been any reports of wild boars in the area. The ranger laughed and said, possibly, and then told them that part of his job was to keep the walking and hiking trails clear of weeds and brush. He walked the trails with a machete, looking just ahead of him at his feet and clear any unwanted vegetation when he smelt a stench, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Looking up, he saw a bipedal, brown, hairy creature staring at him about 13 meters ahead. He froze and stared at it until it turned and disappeared into the thick scrub. My husband and his mate continued on to the fence job but did not hear, smell, or see anything again. A few years later, they were working in a similar landscape south of their previous encounter and heard from several local farmers who had heard similar noises to what they had heard previously, and who had seen a hairy bipedal creature run into their paddocks, grab a sheep or a calf, then run back into the dense forest. There are Yowie researchers who have had similar encounters and taken thermal images of a large bipedal creature. We know they exist, although I'm not sure about the drop bears or hoop snakes. But that's another story. Thank you for taking the time to read this. Cheers, Tony and Graham, Tasmania, Australia. P.S. We're okay if you share our names. All right, you guys, thanks. Appreciate that. I'm not sure what those drop bears, hoop snakes. Never heard of those terms before. I guess that's some other something has been seen or spotted and given a crazy name, right? Thanks for sending that down there. Thanks for sending it down there. Thanks for sending it to us from down there is what I meant to say. I'm a little beat up. Not much sleep. I'm going to get on to another. But quick note. I've watched a few things on Stephen Greer. He is a man who allegedly has a pile of information on beings and spacecraft that are allegedly not from this planet. And he apparently has around 700 whistleblowers. I believe he was bringing 6 or 7 whistleblowers with him to face Congress and deliver everything they know. I don't know if any of you have watched it, but I think I'm going to watch that. I don't know how long it's going to be, or probably imagine it's going to be on YouTube, but it should be interesting. Not that I'm not a big UFO guy, although I've seen them. But I believe everybody needs to be heard, and then take from it what you will or leave it. And I'm sure there's going to be somebody out there who wants to tear down his character to try to dissuade people from going and watching. Quit doing that, you guys. I've had a few people that email me to shred somebody's character. And I've made it clear my stance. I don't jump on bandwagons, unless it's unless it's there's so much frickin' evidence it's ridiculous. You know what I mean? But I don't. When it comes to listening to somebody who's got something sharing with the public, I'll listen, and then I will take from it what I will, or I'll leave it myself. Right? But I deserve the chance to go and listen to these people and figure it out for myself. And that's what we try to encourage people to do here, right? So anyway, I'm going to go check it out, and I'm going to listen to it when I get a chance, and then we'll see what he's got, right? Maybe it will be mind-blowing. Who knows? I don't know. I'm going to find out. Here's another one. Listen to this. This is titled Blue Lights and Sasquatch. What was it? I don't know if this is a Sasquatch connection, but to this day, I cannot explain just what it was that we saw. I've listened to quite a few narratives about strange lights being connected to Sasquatch sightings. This incident is about a strange light that became a terrifying experience, and by design or coincidence, it happened at almost the same location of my possible Sasquatch encounter camping with my horse back in '78. This happened over Memorial Day weekend in 1980. My best friend and I decided to take a survival canoe trip over the weekend. The only thing we took in the way of food was coffee and salt. We intended to live off the land for a couple days. First, a little about my friend. His name is Greg, and he was the black sheep in a family of intellectual, left-leaning people. He was conservative in his politics, and he hunted, trapped, and fished, all activities that his family was not enthusiastic about. I can relate. About the only thing he had in common with his family was that he was an atheist. Although he did not believe in God, he was spiritual in his connection to nature. He absolutely did not believe in anything paranormal. He sort of made the perfect He sort of made the perfect witness to what we saw. Something that I have no doubt was paranormal, and now I have to wonder if it was a Sasquatch connected. Our trip, we left Weir Dam on the East Fork of the Whitewater River in Richmond, Indiana, on Saturday morning with our goal of reaching the Silver Creek boat ramp on Brookville Lake by Monday. It was a fun, leisurely trip, but it did have a few white-knuckle moments along the way with the river itself, mostly involving rapids and downed trees across the river. On Saturday night, we camped on a sandbar and had a great supper of bullhead catfish and wild onions. The night passed peacefully, and after an invigorating swim early in the morning, we resumed our trip. Sunday was being pretty much like the day before, except that we stopped to catch some soft-shelled turtles that had been sunning themselves in a log in a hole of water cut off from the river. Greg caught them by wading into the waist-deep water and stepped on their shells barefooted. I told him he was crazy to do this, but he caught several turtles using this method. Late on Sunday afternoon, we passed under the bridge at Brownsville, Indiana, and headed into the Brookville Lake property. We passed right by the spot where my horse and I spent a terrifying night 2 years prior. And when about 100 yards downstream, Greg motioned to head to shore along a sandbar on the same side of the river that my prior camp had been on. Keep in mind that I was still under the impression that whatever had circled my camp until I fired a shot from my Winchester at 3 a.m. was human, or possibly a ghost. I felt uneasy about his choice of campsites, but I was not going to voice my concerns or mention my harrowing night 2 years earlier. Besides, I wasn't alone. I had a human companion. I will mention that we were only armed with belt knives and a camp axe. Rifles and canoes are not compatible in white water. So we set up our two-man tent, kindled a fire, and while I prepared a turtle for supper, Greg found a bounty of fresh water mussels in the mud at the end of the sandbar. After supper, we let our fire die down and we prepared for an evening of fishing for channel catfish. Now a little about the topography. Across the river from where we camped, a creek entered into the river. The creek meandered down from the northeast, and for a while paralleled the river itself, separated by a high bank. Directly across from us, the creek made a hard right turn in its course and joined the river. Where the creek made its bend, the east bank was a high-cut bank scoured out by years of flooding. All of the land across the river was as well. All the land across the river, as well as behind us, was wooded. I don't know what time it was, but it was full dark, when suddenly, across the river, a good ways off in the scrub woods, we saw a bluish light moving along through the woods. It didn't float, but moved like someone walking over the uneven ground carrying a Coleman lantern. We watched it as the light headed north and discussed what anyone would be doing over in that thick scrub walking around carrying a lantern. The best we could come up with was maybe someone was hunting frogs. Presently the light went out of view, but it still left me with an uneasy feeling. Perhaps about an hour later, we began to see the faintest glow of light coming from upstream in the creek channel across the river. Great, I thought. Someone was going to come right on down to where we were camped. The light steadily grew stronger, and before long it was so bright upstream of the channel of the creek that we could see the shadows of tree branches on the far cut bank of the creek. It was an amazingly bright light that just kept getting stronger. The light being cast was bright enough to see objects on our side of the river. Across the river in the creek channel, it was so bright that a book could have been easily read. Then we saw it. Both Greg and myself sat speechless, transfixed on the bend of the creek, waiting for whoever it was to round the bend and reveal themselves to us, and then it happened. The light, traveling over the middle of the creek, rounded the bend and stopped. The light stopped, as if it was surprised to find us sitting there. And I mean the light. There was no person, no creature, just a brilliant bluish light. As we stared at it, the light suddenly went out. It did not fade out. It went out like someone turned off a switch. This left us blind as bats in the sudden darkness. But we heard nothing, we saw nothing. After a few long seconds, I whispered in a low, raspy voice, "What was that?" Greg answered in just as low a voice, "I don't know." The next thing I heard out of Greg, the atheist, was, "Oh my God." Right about then, I had a strong hit on my fishing pole, and after a battle, landed a 17-pound blue catfish. That broke the tension, and we did not mention it again. In fact, we never spoke to anyone about it. We never spoke to anyone about it. So bizarre. What was it? I don't know. I've seen swamp gas and foxfire, and they in no way resembled what we saw. Maybe it was a Sasquatch related. I just don't know. What I do know is that I have never stepped foot along the Whitewater River north of the Brookville Lake since then. 2 terrifying nights are enough for me. And oh yeah, apparently an atheist found God that night. Steve, this is the incident with me and my horse which occurred 2 years prior to this incident. Just a short note about myself. I'm a 66-year-old retired law enforcement officer. I'm an experienced woodsman, hunter, trapper, and equestrian. I've been more at home in the woods in my lifetime than anywhere else. Now, not so much. My first encounter, which at time I did not think about it involving a Sasquatch, was just a frightening experience that I had no explanation for. It happened one weekend in '78 while camping with my horse on the north end of the Brookville Reservoir property in southeast Indiana. It began with me deciding to take a weekend camping trip by horseback. I had time on my hands and no money, so it seemed like a good way to spend my days off. I only worked 4 nights a week, Monday through Thursday, so on Friday morning I packed light camping gear on my saddle, a blanket and ground cloth, a canvas bucket, some rope, a nose bag for my horse with some oats, a pair of hobbles, and an old 1982 Winchester carbine carried on a scabbard. I had a 17.44 caliber cartridges for my carbine. I also had a tin cup canteen and my food, which consisted of coffee, a can of crazy cheese, and some crackers. It was warm, so I only had a light denim jacket, a change of socks, and buckskin moccasins that I wore while sleeping while camping. I rode about 17 miles that Friday, and towards late afternoon I began to get into the Brookville Reservoir property, specifically with the east fork of the Whitewater River. Specifically with the east fork of the Whitewater River began to feed the lake. I left the gravel road that I had been riding down and moved my horse along an old abandoned roadbed along the river that was no longer allowed access to cars or trucks. There's just a shadow of the former road, and eventually, even that road dwindled away to nothing more than a footpath. I rode into the wooded river bottom and looked for a place to camp. I was having a great time. I made my camp by tying a picket rope between two trees for my mare, then spread out my ground cloth and gathered wood for a fire. I'd brought no flashlight, so a small campfire for coffee, and to have some seeing light till I turned in was necessary. While I made camp, I hobbled my horse and turned her loose to graze on the tender spring grass. I'll mention here, for those who do not know, hobbles are leather straps with a short chain attaching the two leather ends and are hobbled around the horse's front feet to allow them free movement, but stops them from running off. Picture someone trying to move with their shoelaces tied together. Those are horse hobbles. Anyway, while she grazed, I made a cup of instant coffee and had some crackers and cheese. I then took a paperback book from my saddlebags and laid back with my head on my saddle and read while enjoying a cigarette. When the light began to fade, I went and caught up to my mare, and after removing her hobbles, I led her down to the river on the lead rope to get a drink. And this is where the weirdness began. As she was drinking, she suddenly lifted her head from the water, and with her ears held forward, which has indicated something had her attention, she looked intently upriver. I naturally followed the line of her interest and strained my eyes in the waning light of day in an attempt to see what had caught her attention. She was so tense that she had not swallowed her last drink of water, but was holding it in her mouth. The sounds of water dripping from her mouth back into the river was the only sound that I heard. Her demeanor had changed as she was now acting spooked. On the way back to camp, she kept stopping and would stare into the gathering darkness in the woods, staring north as she had at the river. I put her hobbles back on her and tied her to the picket rope between the two trees by a neck rope that around her neck behind her head and fed down through the halter ring under the chin. This type of tying keeps a horse from hurting themselves if they spook while tied. It also saves on broken halters. All the while, as I was getting her situated for the night, she kept acting jumpy. I would move around nervously, then would freeze suddenly motionless and stare upriver. Only her nostrils were moving in an attempt to catch some odor. Here I'll give a little background on my horse. She's a well-trained mount that was used for working livestock. She is unflappable around traffic and could be safely ridden along any road, including highways. I also used her on my trap line. She was not spooked by gunfire or the smell of blood. I owned her until her death in her upper 20s, and except for this night camping, she had only been spooked one other time, and that was the first time she heard a wild turkey gobble. What I'm saying is she's a good solid mount that I could trust in any situation. After I was later married, she would go on to teach wife and eventually both of my sons how to ride. After I was sure that she was secure, I told her to settle down, and taking the collapsible canvas bucket, I went down to the river to bring her back water for the night. By now, there was just the late stages of twilight left. I could see the water and the far bank, but no details of anything. While I was filling the bucket, I suddenly caught sounds of voices coming from upriver. My first thought was, great, I have a bunch of party types nearby. I assumed that this is what my horse had been hearing. Now, as I said, it sounded like 2 or 3 people talking, but nothing they were saying was distinguishable, and much of it reached my ears, sounded like animated chatter, for lack of a better word. Occasionally I would hear someone let out a whoop, and a couple times I heard loud splashes like something heavy had hit the water. I was more irritated than spooked, and I only hoped that they would not wander down near my camp. As I was going back to camp, which is only about 40 feet away, my horse suddenly let out a loud whinny, and the voices instantly stopped. Now that spooked me, and I assumed that I would soon have people in my camp that I had no interest in meeting. My fire was down to coals, and for some reason I felt the need to put more wood on it. And yes, my horse still had not settled down much. She was jittery and was stressing the rope in an attempt to get loose. This was when I took my Winchester out of the saddle scabbard and dug in my saddlebag for the cloth sack that held 10 extra rounds. I had 7 rounds in the carbine's magazine. I sat by the campfire, occasionally stoking it with wood in order to keep some seeing light in my camp. I kept talking to my mare to calm her down. and attempted to read from the book that I brought along. I could only read a few paragraphs before I would concentrate on the night sounds. I no longer the voices from upriver. Okay, probably meant I no longer heard the voices from upriver, but that didn't convince my horse that all was well. She continued to fidget and would let out nickers on occasion. I finally gave up on reading and just sat next to the fire, leaning my against my Winchester, which I had placed between my knees, with the butt of the gun on the ground. Somewhere along, about 11 or 12 o'clock, sleep overtook me and I drifted off while still sitting upright, leaning against my carbine. Around 3 in the morning, I was awakened by all hell breaking loose in my camp. My mare was letting out terrified whinnies and was struggling against her rope to break loose. I think had it not been for those hobbles in her front legs, she would have indeed broken free and run away. I threw a prepared fire bundle on my campfire, which is now down to coals, and as the bundle caught, I had sufficient light to see. I quickly went over to my mare and tried my best to calm her down. It took a bit of soothing, positive talk, but she finally calmed under my touch. Thought she kept her attention riveted towards the dark forest north of the camp. That's when I heard the whistle. Yes, I said a whistle. Someone was letting out low whistles north of me and slightly east toward the river. That confirmed to me that someone, or possibly several someones, were messing with me. I loudly announced that I knew somebody was out there and that they were not scaring me. That was not entirely true. As knowing that someone was close to me did rattle me a bit. I stepped over to my fire and placed wood on it. Then I picked up my Winchester. Having that old carbine in my hands gave me some comfort. This was when I began to hear the footsteps. Whoever was out there in the dark began to walk in a semicircle around my camp. They started at the river, back, and walked westward, still north of my camp. Then they swung around south and walked to a point where they turned east and walked to the river back south of my camp. Now I know the sounds of the forest creatures. I know the sounds the forest creatures make around here. Squirrels can sound like a buffalo traveling through the leaves, and deer generally make no sound. At that time, about the only large animal besides deer in this area would have been a coyote. And this is no coyote. I also knew that no prey animal would spend any time in close contact with humans, and likewise with the alpha predators, which were coyotes and foxes. There was an occasional bobcat, but they were rarely seen back then, although today we have a healthy population of bobcats here. This was definitely bipedal. It was slow and heavy. After a period of silence, the route around my camp was repeated, a slow-paced, heavy-footed semicircle until they had reached the starting point again. This went on for the better part of an hour, which an occasional whistle and once a grunt or low growl, I couldn't tell which. My horse definitely had them made as she twisted and turned to keep her ears turned to the sounds. Only my touch kept her from blowing a gasket again. Finally, I had experienced enough. I loudly announced that I was armed and I would open fire if whoever was out there did not leave immediately. With that, I levered a shell in the chamber of my then 67-year-old carbine, and, elevating the barrel so I didn't actually hit anyone, I fired a shot into the air. The sudden report of the 44-40 round split the early morning darkness and echoed through the river bottom. The sound of the shot made whoever was circling my camp suddenly take off in a loud, crashing run through the woods. I'm sorry this is so anticlimactic, but that was it. Nothing else makes any sounds near my camp for the remainder of the night. While not calm, my mare quit struggling as she no longer was letting frightened whinnies. I sat by the fire and I made a cup of coffee until dawn. At the first hint of light, I gathered my gear and saddled my horse. I know one thing. The rope I had tied between two trees to tie my mare to, it had been pulled so tight by her night-long struggling that I actually had to cut it with my knife and leave the ends of the rope tied around the trees. Been there, done that. This ended my weekend of camping. I decided that I'd return home, and by the way, once we cleared the area, my mare was back to her old dependable self as if nothing had happened. I was the only one rattled by the incident. Never for a moment did my mind explore the possibility that I was being harassed by a Sasquatch. I mean, Sasquatch lived in the Pacific Northwest, not in southeastern Indiana. Now, 43 years later, I have no doubts that the thing that was around my camp was indeed a Sasquatch. Over the years, I've encountered two sets of footprints, one set in snow and one set in the forest. Both sets were found in the Charles C. Deem Wilderness in the Hoosier National Forest while hiking off-trail by compass and topographical map. Both sets were found miles from any existing hiking trail, and further still from any roads. I've included some photos taken. I also found structures in the forest that were made entirely of broken tree branches. The ends of all the branches were broken off to the trees. The wood had darkened, but it was plainly evident that the branches were not cut. Whatever broke them had to have had significant strength to rip them from the trees. Additionally, the structures made no sense as they were not shelters. But this all culminated in 2008 when on a drizzly November evening I experienced a visual contact with a Sasquatch with a witness. My son, who was home on leave from the Army, he and I were driving alongside a field that bordered a river less than a mile from my farm. I looked over into the field as I drove along and suddenly I slammed my foot down on the brake while at the same time and same instant my son blurted out, "What the hell is that?" That was a 9 to 10 foot tall being striding across the field. It appeared to be all black. It had a conical head and very long arms that swung while it walked. The stride of the creature was enormous. Because of this sighting, I no longer hunt. I won't even sit out at night in my own yard unless people are with me, and I keep a shotgun loaded with alternating slugs and buckshot shells by my side. I won't allow any curtains to be open after dark. Did the sight scare me? Hell yes, it scared me, and it still does. Forgive my grammar, I'm not a professional writer. I found this interesting. Steve. All right. Of course, we found it interesting, Steve. Appreciate you sending that in. And one thing we point out with the law enforcement officers, every time they write in, it's very detailed, right? It's a bit much, isn't it? It's a bit much to have that reality slap in your face. Seeing one. It's amazing. One strong pattern scares the shit out of 99.9% of the people that are faced with it. Thanks for sending that in, man. I'm sorry that you've lost your ability to go out freely in the woods. Many have, right? It's a sad thing. Sucks when the horses cinch that rope up. Yeah, that happened a few times. Now, ooh, nice salmon. Nice ripple down there from a big fish. Okay, focus. One more, you guys. This is titled Scared to the Core. Steve, first I'd like to thank you for opening my eyes when it comes to Bigfoot. I always have thought about it as a missing link, caveman, mixed breed animal, but still an animal. You and the others have made me realize that they are most likely multi-dimensional beings, hence lack of evidence, a body. The portal or gate theory is the way they must be traveling to and from here in this dimension. I've never even fathomed that thought. My visual encounter happened back in the summer of 1990. I was 19 years old at the time and dating a girl that I had a crush on for most of my high school. Quote, let's leave her name out of this, quote, okay? No problem. She was very much into showing and breeding horses. And a beauty she was, and was the reason I was up in the Allegheny Mountains at the time of my encounter. I agreed to go on a week-long horseback trail ride camping trip with her and a group of people who were not my type, just nothing in common with anyone else there. After 2 days of the 7 we were going to be there for, I decided to get my Honda 250R three-wheeler off the back of the truck and take it for a spin. Not being a good one to trail ride with, having an extended rear axle and flat track tires and louder than anything else that was there. Kind of funny now. I was riding with 2 guys that were on 4-wheelers and was the lead bike that had no idea where the hell I was going or where the trail led to. The others have to follow me at this point because there was nowhere to pull off and my ATC was too wide to get past. The trail was like 40 degrees uphill to the right and a steep downhill to the left and then went down to a creek. And it was mirrored pretty much on the opposite side, about 100 feet across the trail. It was going downhill, headed to a river below. It finally opened up to about 20 feet. Now the 2 guys that were eating dirt for a mile or two immediately tried to pass me, and I was just not going to let it happen. So I dropped it down and twisted the throttle and was gone ahead, but across the ravine something caught my eye, and I looked over thinking there was another bike, thinking another bike was coming down the other side, Okay, we're lacking a lot of punctuation, okay, you guys? Bear with me. Was coming down the other side. To my surprise, it was a massive, hair-covered animal, probably 8 feet tall. I say that confidently because he was way bigger than my dad, and he stands 6'8" and weighs 260 plus pounds. But once my eyes focused on it, I realized that it was matching my speed at about 35 miles per hour on 2 legs. And the trails are coming together within 10 feet at the bottom of the hill, about 1,500 feet ahead. I looked back over, and I looked back over, and it looked back at me. Seemed like time went into slow motion mode. I, looking at a man of sorts, not an animal. Remember it like I'm still there in that moment. My heart's pounding just typing this. He had greenish brown eyes, dark brown stringy hair that was either wet or just greasy dirty. It was covering part of his face from the wind at that speed. His skin was gray-black color, weathered but like ours. I could see his teeth, and again like ours, no canines. It had little to no hair in his chest. His legs were like tree trunks. I had this feeling that washed over me that was like, leave. He started pulling ahead of me. The distance between him and I was probably 60 feet across the ravine, and he dropped down into the ravine and in 2 leaps was at the bottom and started up my side. Would have been right in front of me in 3 seconds, and I did what any 19-year-old guy in a fast trike would do. I clamped the brakes, came to a stop faster than the other guys because one guy hit me so hard it tore the little rear fender I had off, bent the axle, and just about tore the tire off the rim. The other one just missed me and went into the bush. I spun a 180-degree turn, and flat tire, bent axle and all, I was gone. It stopped running, turned to my direction, and let out a blood-curdling scream/yell that I could hear from over a quarter mile away over a screaming 252 stroke. I was so scared, I put the 3-wheeler in the bed of my Chevy truck without the ramps, bent the hell out of the tailgate, and broke the rear cab window in the process. I didn't care. Jumped in the truck and went home, to Northeast Ohio. Left the girlfriend there and everything. It was 2 days later that I went back to my girlfriend. Luckily, she had a lot of friends in that group. We didn't have cell phones, and she figured the way I left there was an emergency, and I agreed. When I got back there, I had the feeling of being watched the entire time, but I've never seen them since, and I know they're real. And I don't know why we aren't told the truth about them, and we not be able to handle some of it. And so you probably meant we might not be able to handle some of it, because one fact is it's going to rewrite history, guarantee that. This encounter happened to me, and with everyone else that was around me. Only one other seen and heard what I did. That was the guy that smashed into me, and he told everyone the day of was ridiculed and made fun of to the point he left. I never knew his name, but I'm glad I'm not in the club alone. Thanks again for having a place like this to vent. Email me back if you need any info I think I can give. If you need any info you think I can give. Sincerely, Bobby Goodrich. Bobby, appreciate you, man. Absolutely appreciate you sending in that truth. And so do a lot of other people. That's frickin' terrifying. That's a terrifying experience for anybody. Nobody's watching me that I know of. A friend of mine was hunting just down here a little bit, down the road a little farther, hang a left up a service road called Twin One. You can Google it. He doesn't have any interest in this topic at all, and that's fine, but he loves hunting. But he did tell me the topic came up mildly with us one time, and he said, well, he goes, one time I was up Twin One, and I got kind of spooked out of there, and took off and left. I go, oh yeah, well, how come? He said, oh, no, I guess there's some Indians in the bush above me, and they're whooping at me, 2 of them. And they're on either side of the road, and they're just whooping at me. It kind of freaked me out, so I got the hell out of there. I'm like, oh yeah, no shit. I I didn't get into it with him too much, but I just looked at him and said, I'll assure you it wasn't two Indians whooping at you up Twin 1, up top there on either side of the road in the deep timber. Club member doesn't know it. Anyway, this is a good little break. I love it down here. I love these mountains big time. I'm gonna get going. And who knows, maybe if it's not overcast, I'll be able to take you guys up on the top of the mountains tomorrow. We'll see.